Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Kopp. I'm the CEO of the Denver Foundation. And before we begin, we're going to take a few minutes for translation information. First, thanks to Indira Guzman, who will share instructions.
Good. Hello, everyone. My name is Indira Guzman, and I am here with the Community Language Co-op. For this meeting, we have made a commitment to language justice. What that means is that we want everyone to engage and participate in the language of their heart, or the language that they feel most comfortable in. So for this, we're going to use the tools of simultaneous interpretations. On the bottom of the screen, you will see an icon that says interpretation. Please select the language that you prefer to engage in. We will have Spanish and English and ASL interpretation pinned on the screen. So I will repeat this in Spanish and then we'll get started. Muy buenas tardes, mi nombre es Indira Guzmán. Esta mañana estoy aquí con la Community Language Co-op y los organizadores de este evento han hecho un compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Lo que eso significa es que queremos que todos participen en el idioma de su corazón o en el idioma en el que se sientan más cómodos. Para esto vamos a usar la interpretación simultánea. En la parte de abajo en su pantalla van a ver un icono que dice interpretación. Por favor, seleccionen el idioma en el que prefieren escuchar. Tenemos inglés, español y también tenemos ASL que estará en la pantalla. Si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor, avísenos. Muchas gracias. Let's go ahead and turn on interpretation.
Great. If you're having any trouble with the interpretation, please feel free to put a question in the Q&A and a member of our staff will get in touch with you. Today, we plan for a 60-minute discussion of the Foundation's new strategic framework, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. We welcome you to send questions throughout the conversation. We'll be capturing all and responding to as many as possible during the session. Following this meeting, you will immediately receive a copy of the 2021 Strategic Framework publication, which is also on our website. Next week, you will receive a link to the recording of the video, as well as answers to questions we were not able to answer today. Before I introduce our panelists, we honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. In total, 48 tribes have called this land home. We respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respect to them and give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. Now I will introduce our panelists. First, our interpreters. Our Spanish interpreter is Indira Guzman. Our ASL interpreters are Ruth de Jesus and Jessica Gomez. Our panelists are Javier Alberto Soto, our president and CEO, John Lowy, the chair of our board of trustees, Dr. Nita Mosby-Tyler, immediate past chair, and Desa West, our chief impact officer. So I'm going to start off with a question for Javier. We welcomed you to Colorado last October 2019 that is, and less than 6 months later, we entered what is coming up on a year of social distancing. So Javier, how did you adjust to a new city and establish new relationships in this environment?
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa, and thank you all for joining us today. You know, Alyssa, I actually would start on day 3 of my moving here from Florida, where we had a freak early October snowstorm. That was my big welcome. I expected to ease into winter, and I didn't get that opportunity. So on day 3, it was a massive snowstorm, and on month 6, the world shuts down due to a pandemic. So yeah, it was a little unexpected of a first year and a half here. But you know, something that's been clear to me since day 1 is that this is an incredibly resilient and a deeply generous place. And I think those two things can get you through anything, whether it's a snowstorm or even a pandemic that none of us were anticipating. And that's what I discovered, you know, frankly, from the moment I got on my bike and started touring around Denver and visiting with communities throughout the metro area. And also when we asked the community to step up, right when the COVID crisis struck, we asked the community to step up and they did so in really meaningful and powerful ways. So that's my first big takeaway from my first year and a half is just the resilience and the generosity that exists here. You know, my other big takeaway from 2020 in particular is that change is inevitable. And so the vision that we are articulating today to the community for the Denver Foundation is one that needs to be rooted in flexibility and needs to allow us to pivot when circumstances change and dictate that we in fact do pivot. That's why, by the way, this is a strategic framework and not a detailed, granular strategic plan, because I don't think any of us can predict what's going to happen 10 years from now in this community or in this country. And so we need that ability to be flexible. We need to embed flexibility in everything that we do so that we can pivot when we need to pivot. And lastly, on the bike tour, I do expect to get back on the bike once it's safe for us to be in community again. And this time I'll be much more acclimated to the altitude, which was a little bit of a challenge early on.
Great. You mentioned being flexible. It's tough to go into a planning period for 10 years when we're in an extraordinary year. So let's hear a little bit about how COVID informed our thinking on the strategic framework.
I think COVID was a really important piece of changing our thinking and allowing us to pivot a little as we thought about the strategic framework. We had a whole plan in place around how the framework development was going to happen, but we didn't expect to learn the lessons that we learned as an organization based on our response to COVID. You know, there was, I think, at the very beginning, the opportunity for us to get dollars out the door in a really quick way because of the deep relationships that we had with organizations across the state, frankly, into community. And recognizing that those kinds of relationships were something that was really powerful and really important and a real asset of the Denver Foundation, I think was one lesson that we learned, that, you know, listening to community and being connected to community was a big piece of what we wanted to incorporate in the framework moving forward. We also learned a lot about how to simplify. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but we had gone through a whole process to simplify our grant making. And then we had a round of COVID grant making in which we spent 10 days with 342 applications and were able to make $1 million worth of grants out the door. Now that is compared to 5 months in our regular grant making process. So we know we can do it. And that simplification is a really big piece of it. And finally, we learned a lot about our collaborative opportunity, particularly with other funders and with our donors. We worked with the Governor's Fund. We worked with Bonfils Stanton to create an arts and culture relief fund for arts and culture organizations. We were able to stand up the Black Resiliency in Colorado Fund and really expand our critical needs fund as a result of a partnership with our many donors meeting needs out in the community. And I think all of those lessons really informed our work as we moved forward with the strategic framework.
Alyssa, I would add, you know, maybe from a different angle, just how it brought everyone at the foundation together in such a meaningful way. Starting with the leadership of the board, frankly, Nita will recall that early on during this crisis, we were having daily phone calls, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. You know, the board really stepped up in such an important way and let the staff know, we have your back. Let's get through this. We need to be here for the community, so let us know what you need. And then the staff just really pulled together in such a tremendous way in a new environment that none of us were accustomed to. And just got all of the work that Desa just articulated, just got it done in such a quick and effective manner. So I was really proud of the way that everybody came together early on that really did allow us to meet the moment. You know, and something else that I would add here is there's 2 things that philanthropy isn't often associated with, and that's humility and urgency. You know, first, as Desa talked about, you know, it's so critical that we're deeply embedded in community, that we're listening to community. That did help us to tear down barriers quickly and to go where people were, to understand what the needs were of the community so that we could then turn around and meet the moment as rapidly as we did. And we also obviously learned that we could move with tremendous urgency when necessary. And I think now, you know, the goal for us is to continue that sense of urgency. because even as we start to see light at the end of the tunnel with the COVID crisis, it's not like that's the only crisis on our plates as a society. You know, we need to address systemic racism. We need to address the climate crisis. And I think we need to address these things in the same way and with the same sense of urgency that we met the COVID crisis. Many of you are familiar with Edgar Villanueva and the book that he published on philanthropy a couple of years ago. And he writes that philanthropy moves at a glacial pace. Rome burns while we fiddle with another survey on strategies, another study on impact. And that's why we began building this new vision. Literally on my 10th day here is the first board meeting that I had at the Denver Foundation, where we said, let's start crafting this new vision and let's get to work immediately. And then when the crisis hit, we thought, well, should we slow down or stop this framework building process? And the board, staff, everybody said, absolutely not. We need to forge ahead. The problems are too massive. And we have a responsibility and obligation of this community to keep moving forward. So that also is something that we will continue to look to, is that sense of urgency with all of these many challenges that we face as a society.
Thanks, Javier. So going into this, I know listening was the first priority. So let's talk a little bit. We won't talk too much about surveys since they slow us down, but we definitely wanted to be in listening mode. So let's talk about how we collected the feedback.
I'm 100% going to talk about surveys because they were really important for us as we thought about what opportunities the community had to provide us with feedback. So one piece that we spent a lot of time on was conducting focus groups and small group conversations with everyone from grassroots community leaders to nonprofit organizations to donors to civic leaders, really a wide panoplia of folks across our community to hear what they had to say about their vision for the future, their worries about our community, and what their thoughts were about the Denver Foundation. We also offered the opportunity for people to fill out a survey because we wanted people to have a chance to tell us anonymously what they were thinking about the community work, and in particular about where they thought the Denver Foundation's role should go. We, through that work, received about 1,200 points of feedback, and we supplemented that with work that had been done by dozens of community partners who had recently also done listening sessions, so that we really had that full breadth and sense of what people felt was most important and most critical. And then finally, our consultants, EAC, did some very in-depth interviews with key stakeholders of the foundation, with 100% of staff members, with almost 100% of our board. And so really rounded out the set of feedback that we used to inform our thinking about every aspect and every corner of our organization, which this strategic framework really covers.
And John, you were part of the guiding committee. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the role of the guiding committee?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And just before I do that, I notice we have 283 participants on this call. I want to thank you all for having the interest and being motivated to listen to what we have to say. And your interest. We really appreciate the fact that that you want to know about this new framework and what the changes in the Denver Foundation are going to mean to the community. What I guess the main point I want to make about the guiding committee, because the guiding committee is representative of our approach to this entire process, and that is it is a board and staff cooperative effort. It's not one side driving the train and the other being in the caboose. Everybody's involved. The guiding committee itself, which was also true for the process of hiring the consultant that we brought in to help us with this, was made up of half board and half staff. And as I say, that was true throughout the process. Obviously, we rely very heavily on the expertise of our staff and their experience in doing the really hard work, the heavy lifting of putting this this new framework together. But board was involved at every stage and involved extensively. The guiding committee had regular meetings with the consultants who came in and gave us progress reports on what DESA was talking about, the progress of all the different interactions with the community and with the rest of the staff and the rest of the board. And we had opportunities to react to that information and offer suggestions about how things might be modified going forward, or where we might have seen some gaps. So I'll probably say it again as we're speaking, that this is a partnership, not just with the community, which of course it is, and that's critical, but internally. The board and its resources, the staff and their resources, everybody pulling together to try to do the best we can for the community.
Great. I'm going to pause for 1 second. Point of order. For our ASL interpreters, we can call the Denver Foundation TDF going forward, so that you don't have to spell it out every time. I am in charge of our communication. It's breaking my heart to call us TDF, but I can see you working hard, so thank you. With that, let's talk about how we decided where to place racial equity in the framework. The Foundation's been working on equity, inclusion, and diversity for 25 years. How do we decide where to center that?
Well, Alyssa, I want to start by thanking you for recognizing the 25-year commitment to this work. And frankly, I want to thank former CEO David Miller for that leadership, because long before anyone in community philanthropy across the country was talking about racial equity, David and TDF were leading the way to have these conversations and move organizations like ours into this space. So it is building on that incredible foundation that we've continued this work and seek to expand on it over the next course of this strategic framework. And one thing that has always been fundamentally important to all of us at the Foundation is that racial equity not simply be a part of the structure, that it actually be the structure itself, that it not be a separate programmatic element of what we do at the Denver Foundation, that it be part of everything that we do at the Denver Foundation across all departments, across all aspects of our work. And from racial equity springs an ability to create and elevate equity across the board in every aspect of society. So that's why we believe so strongly with the board's leadership and everyone on the staff side, that this had to be, again, the structure, not just a part of the structure.
Sorry, Nita, you were the chair of the trustees at that time. Can you talk a little bit about that conversation with trustees and that buy-in from the trustees?
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. What a journey. And I think one of the things that I'll say to add to Javier's comment is the long history of the work that the Denver Foundation has done made this a little bit easier for us to begin to talk about. I remember a couple of decades ago being very much immersed in the work of the Denver Foundation and the Inclusiveness Project. And even in that project, though we were using and centering the word inclusiveness, it was very centered on race. And so it wasn't a big departure to go from an inclusiveness project centered on race to very explicitly calling out racial equity as an espoused value for us. I do remember having the initial conversations with the board. The organization had decided we do want to center here on racial equity, but one of the things I had to be concerned with is the readiness of the board and where they were on that continuum of equity and their personal understanding. The organization absolutely was galvanized around this, but how do we get individual people in the system ready to advance the work in the way that was necessary. So we spent quite a bit of time on education and learning about our history and those kinds of things that the Denver Foundation could influence through its racial equity work. And I would also agree with Javier. What we did not want was for racial equity work and focus and centering to be an appendage that was off to the side of all of the other things that the Denver Foundation was doing. We wanted it to be institutionalized, but also integrated in how we operated operationally and financially and in all of our practices and policies. So the board was on board with that. The last thing, Alyssa, I would say about it is I think it's important to note here, because I think it means something, that talking about racial equity and committing to racial equity wasn't born out of a sentinel event in our society. There were a lot of organizations across the country that decided to do something with the death of George Floyd. It was a moment that created a movement. I have to say to you, if I can just be completely transparent here, to focus on racial equity at the Denver Foundation wasn't grounded in a sentinel event at all. As a matter of fact, it was happening a year or more before George Floyd's death. It came out of a moral obligation to eradicate systemic racism. And that has been a through line in the organization for as long as I can remember. So to answer your question very directly, getting consensus from the board was not a difficult thing. The journey was in the education and the sharing that a board requires to be their very best in their roles as you advance a system like racial equity.
Thank you, Nita. We're going to share a slide now that highlights the Foundation's new vision, values, and core purpose. As Nita shared the word integrated, we felt that it was important to integrate the racial equity work into our values very explicitly. John, would you like to talk about an element of the vision or values that stood out to you? John, you're on mute.
I couldn't unmute because my picture was not on the screen. Little technological glitch. I think all I really want to say about this is that any of you who have worked on the wordsmithing of mission statements and vision statements and purposes and these kinds of things, it's a really interesting process. I think that the thing that stands out to me is the focus on racial equity, that it is integrated into all parts of this. And I think a lot of the conversation that we had was, is there some place that we can leave it out? Are we putting it in too many places? I mean, it was some of that kind of conversation, and it's reflective of the fact that this is something that we all reached a consensus on. We wanted our vision, mission, purpose, and values to reflect that, that guidance and that direction that we're taking. So as you look through these, you'll see that in addition to how we plan to do the work, we talk about the work itself, the racial equity work, over and over again.
I really appreciate what you're saying there, John. I do think in many ways what we're talking about is this disruption of what traditional philanthropy has been, what it's looked like, how it's operated. And though we are a work in progress there, and through this strategic framework, we can refine that every step of the way. I do think anytime you pause to interrogate your own system, then you're really disrupting some of the things that have gotten in the way along the way in philanthropy. And that's exactly what we're doing at the Denver Foundation. It's a tough word, but we are interrogating our own systems. And of course, you want to do that before anybody else interrogates it for you. We're doing that. And so this careful and thoughtful and meaningful examination of every component part of this foundation, from board all the way down to policies and procedures that are internal in the foundation, have been substantive bodies of work that we've been doing and we're committing to continue to do. I think the disruption of traditional philanthropy, you can't skip. I believe you can't skip racial equity either, but you certainly can't skip disrupting the systems that have brought us here. Sometimes that's painful. Sometimes that means you have to look at things like who your donors are or what the donor intent might be. Sometimes it means that you have to look at your HR practices or your board composition, whatever that is. We've been committed to doing that. And so this disruption piece, I think, is just a natural yet bumpy part of what racial equity calls for. And the foundation has been really committed to doing that.
Thank you. So with the mission, vision, and values set, the foundation landed on 3 areas of focus. Those are community impact, our business model, and operational excellence. And we're going to talk about community impact first. One phrase that jumps out every time there's discussion of the strategic framework is that the foundation wants to be a learning organization. Let's talk a little bit about what that means.
You know, Alyssa, I think this builds on some of the things we've already talked about this morning. It builds on the themes around humility and what Nita was just articulating around disruption. I think all of that starts with acknowledging that we don't have all the answers. We want to be a trusted partner, want to open the door, we want to listen, because we need to seek the answers constantly, especially in such an ever-changing and rapidly changing world. And so by understanding that inherent truth that we don't have all the answers, I think that's what gives us the flexibility to make those adjustments as we listen and learn continuously and adjust to be able to be more impactful and more effective as the stewards of this community's endowment and drive the impact that we seek. You know, Denver Foundation is coming up on its 100th anniversary, and it's this market intelligence that has defined the Denver Foundation for almost 100 years now.
Wow, I can't believe we're that old. We look kind of nice for 100 years old. Yeah. I appreciate what you're saying, Javier. You're spot on about this tension sometimes that I think happens between trying to know everything while learning. And I just have a simple equation here. We have never had a system of racial equity in this country before. The end, period. And because we've never had one, the expectation that any organization would be an expert right out of the chute on how to advance racial equity, I think is mythical at best. So being a learning organization in this area is something that I think the foundation has committed to. We'll use our expertise because we've got some long-running expertise, but we'll not come into this work with an arrogance that says we know it all. And I appreciate that about the organization. I've watched that happen over the years too, particularly as the board has gone through its learning process about what this is and what this is not, how this is different than what the historical inclusiveness project centered on race was as compared to what deep racial equity work is. And so to stay in that spirit of learning is how I think we strengthen our racial equity tactics and strategies, and to stay humble with our humble expertise in that is, I think, what carries us into the next 100 years as a foundation.
Right. Now, when we ask for feedback, you receive positive and constructive feedback. So let's just confront what was some of the feedback that was challenging to hear.
it was really helpful, is what I would start with, and really consistent. We got really consistent feedback from our community listening, as well as from a survey that we did with the Center for Effective Philanthropy right around the same time that we were doing this work. And we heard, I would say, three major things in addition to that plea to us to be a learning versus a knowing organization and really be in relationship with people. One was that our processes were too complex. We've talked about the way that COVID kind of tore that down for us and shown a spotlight, but our partners had been seeing that for a long time and had been experiencing the Denver Foundation's processes as being onerous, particularly for the level of grant making that we were doing, and invited us to really take a look at that and think very carefully about our application process, about our reporting process, about our site visit process. So lots of work ahead of us to make that something that works for our partners out in the community. The second thing that we heard was about responsiveness, which was a hard thing to hear, that we weren't necessarily getting back to people in the 48 hours that is our customer service standard, and people were having to wait longer for emails and phone calls. And what that told me is that we had flipped the script. We weren't thinking of nonprofits as being the necessary fundamental piece of part of our work in addition to our donors. We were thinking of ourselves as being the center of the work. And that was something that we really needed to take a look at. And then I think this comment that Javier and Nita have both made about humility was something that really struck us as well, really needing to show up in community in a humble position and to connect with community in a way that really showed our deep respect and our deep valuing of everyone's work.
I appreciate Desa being so transparent with all of this, because look, criticism is not fun to hear for anyone. Sometimes it can even feel personal, but particularly for a community foundation, I think it's important that we solicit feedback and criticism, and then that we own it, that we act on it. It feels great when you get patted on the back and told, oh, you're the greatest, but you learn nothing from that. When instead you get told where you fell short and maybe get kicked a little lower than your back, that's when you actually learn stuff. You know, I remember when I first came out of law school, my first day on the job as a lawyer, my boss said to me, it's okay to lose a case early. Clearly, they were not giving me the most important cases in the office at that time. But he said, the important thing is that you then learn from that loss and that you never lose another case again. And so it's in that learning process that only comes when we're actually being given tough criticism and tough feedback that we can improve. And that's something that we absolutely are committed to embedding throughout this strategic framework, is to always be listening and always acting on the feedback that we receive so that we can do a better job, frankly.
Thank you. I want to just encourage people to keep submitting questions. We'd really appreciate them. We are tracking them and we'll get to as many as possible today. In that feedback, what did people tell us to continue? What did people say is going well and we should do more of?
I think there were a whole variety of things, and those things were really exciting for all of us to hear. One really related to our donors and the work that we're doing to provide excellent customer service and strong stewardship of those donors. And I'd love for John to talk a little bit more about his experience there. Folks also told us that there was a real value in our community-led and community-centered work. through our Strengthening Neighborhoods program, our supportive community organizing, other things that we were doing to really support grassroots community. And as one of our core values, that was really invigorating to hear. And then finally, just an amazing outpouring of support for our equity, inclusion, and diversity work. And that was also very encouraging because it is center of what we do. So, John, do you want to talk a little bit more about the donors?
Sure, be glad to. So I think what we heard was that our donors want us to continue to be the home for generosity in Metro Denver. That's quite a challenge, and one that we hope to live up to, and we hope we've done a pretty good job in the past, notwithstanding some critique, all of which is, as Desa and Javier said, extremely valuable. I came into a relationship with the Denver Foundation as a donor. I set up a donor advised fund. There are many options to do that in the private sector, as well as other alternatives in community foundation world. And I did it because it was an opportunity for me not just to set aside some resources to meet my philanthropic goals as they were at the time, but to learn about the community and to engage more with the community in the Denver area. That is what the Denver Foundation provided for me, and that's what we hope to provide other people as they engage in their journey of philanthropy. And I have to be honest and say that one of the key things, in addition to the opportunity for community understanding and involvement and education and information, was the quality of the investment management. And I don't think that we should shortchange that at all. The Denver Foundation has a long history of being a very careful and in exercising fiduciary responsibility over our donors' funds. That's something that's very important to us. And in fact, it's something that we've continued to focus on over this past year as we've transitioned to a new investment advisor. So I think that the journey begins in a lot of ways in terms of interacting with the Community Foundation. For me, it was as a donor. For some of you watching today, that's the case. For others of you, they're very different access points. But we want to welcome everybody along that journey to get as much from this organization as you possibly can and to contribute as much as you possibly can. I didn't think that I'd be on the board 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, when I started my donor advised fund. And now I'm very proud and excited to be contributing in that way. So I think, we're going to have a continuation of that which has drawn over, I think, 1,000 donor advised funds and other funds into our management and our orbit.
Great, John. Let's stick with you for a minute. The Foundation has a history of supporting advocacy, community groups, neighborhood organizing, but in the new framework, the word policy is very prominent. What does this mean for the Foundation?
Well, Javier earlier talked about change in the context of COVID and other things. I think we can talk about change. I mean, everybody can feel it globally, nationally, state and local, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. How do we navigate as a community changes in the economic system, changes in healthcare? How do we address the impacts of, as Nita said, the lack of racial equity in our society and in our community? How do we best do that? We believe that more engagement with government policy making, by using the expertise that we have, the extensive community engagement that we have, we can bring issues, frame them in perhaps a new way, a more effective way, a more collaborative way to public policy makers. so that they can take advantage of that to make better decisions and to drive responses to change and to drive change itself. So, I mean, we could go into a lot of detail about what that means. Certainly it means collaboration. It means working with other foundations. It means working with our nonprofit community. It means working with the business community. And we're going to do all those things going forward because philanthropy, the giving of money to organizations in and of itself is not sufficient to address the anxiety and the struggles that people are having in a time of rapid change.
Alyssa, if I could build on that, John's absolutely right. And as we've said already, the challenges that society is facing are massive. They're truly massive. And at the same time, the number of institutions that are trusted to solve these problems are fewer and fewer. And so a community foundation, I think, not only has the ability, it has the obligation to bring people together to craft solutions to these challenges, and then to work in partnership with the public sector in particular to advance those solutions. I think we want to create a marketplace for ideas where every voice is welcome and everyone can help to craft these solutions to these really deeply rooted problems and challenges, as Nita said earlier, that exist, frankly, not only in this community, but throughout the country.
You know, Javier, I appreciate you saying that. And John, thank you too for what you've shared with us too. And this is an acknowledgement, I think, that philanthropy can't create an equitable society all by itself. It's an acknowledgement that the collectiveness of this work is mandatory. And so I think one of the roles that philanthropy plays here as it's interrogating its own systems is that who else should we be partnering with to advance this work? And I think you're absolutely right. If we're not creating policy out of that, then it's tougher. Dr. Martin Luther King said the very same thing. If we're not moving towards policies or policy changes, what is our work? And so we will be very conscious of that along the way. And in some cases for the Denver Foundation, that might be new territory for us. Who we're co-creating with, what we're co-creating might in fact look very different than it has historically through this strategic framework. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by James Baldwin, and it says, "Not everything can be faced, or not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." And one of the things that we are talking about here is facing the things that need to be changed, not just changing, facing the things that have to be changed, which means we may have to tell ourselves some truths, some complicated truths to get the job done in racial equity. So we can't do it alone. Acknowledging that would be important. And what that co-creation looks like, I think, will manifest through those kinds of conversations.
Great. Thanks, Nita. One more last question on the community impact focus. And this is a structural change. Previously, the foundation included a programs department that oversaw grant making and a philanthropic services group that focused on donor services. Those departments have been modified and brought together as the impact group. So let's talk about the purpose of this structural change.
Sure, and what I would say is, in my mind, there's no need for that division that you just explained, Alyssa, because the value proposition of a community foundation is built on the partnerships and the deep knowledge that we have of our community. So we're combining that under one unit to elevate the value proposition. This team will match the deep community knowledge with our deep relationships with the philanthropists we work with. And the goal is just to drive greater impact by having these folks working side by side each and every day to deliver that impact. And, frankly, something else I would add is, I think our objective, our goal should be to move from assets under management towards assets under influence. And yes, that can mean co-investing in some of the priorities and projects that the foundation is supporting, perhaps out of our endowment, but it also means being a trusted advisor to philanthropists to help them invest in those areas that they feel deeply passionate about as well. Again, tapping into that resource of community knowledge that we have throughout the organization. That's what I think our partners expect from us. And by having this team working side by side, I just think we're going to be much better equipped to deliver on that promise.
Sorry, 1 second. I lost my script. All right. Thank you for that. And that model will change, points of contact, and we'll be rolling all that out. You'll be getting more information about that. But really, this really dynamically connected group serving the community.
Well, and Alyssa, earlier you asked about what we learned from COVID, and frankly, this did inform this new structural change. And maybe Desa can talk a little bit about this, because we had to throw this in motion as soon as COVID struck. And once we realized that it was working really well, we thought, wait a minute, this is one of those things maybe that we need to think about doing longer term.
I think that's right. And I think from my perspective, this is really just the best of bringing all of our philanthropy together into one space. And it creates an opportunity for additional connections, for us to provide excellent customer service, both to our nonprofit partners and to our donor partners. And really to showcase the fact that our donor work and our discretionary work, our community work is interwoven and interconnected in some beautiful ways that creates change and support all across our community in many, many, many different ways. And so bringing that all together to be able to deepen that philanthropic footprint and to create those open doors for everyone is part of, I think, the premise behind creating the impact group.
Great, thanks, Desa. The next area we're going to talk about is refining our business model. And we've been getting some questions about our assets and asset management. So let's jump into it. Javier, will you talk about activating assets for mission?
Absolutely. We've all talked about how big the challenges are that we face. One thing that we haven't said yet, but that is obvious, is that our resources are finite. They're limited. And then when philanthropy tries to drive impact solely out of a 5% or whatever distribution, we limit ourselves even further. So that's what we mean by activating all assets in furtherance of our mission. We need to deploy all the tools in the toolbox. We've talked a little bit about policy. We also need to think about how we're driving all of our financial assets, again, to promote racial equity, to help solve these crises that we face in society. And by the way, we also can do this by not only preserving, but growing our endowment. And I believe strongly in the power of endowment. I remember a few years ago when I was at the Miami Foundation, we celebrated our 50th anniversary, and we kicked off the celebration by making grants to the original 7 grantees of the Miami Foundation 50 years prior. All still in Miami, all still doing really important, great work in community. And then I said, hey, where did that initial seed money for the endowment come from? Who were those corporate backers 50 years ago that seeded the Miami Foundation's endowment? And guess what? None of those corporate entities were still in existence 50 years later. Yet the legacy that they created by building that endowment was still having tremendous impact in the community. That's the power of endowment. That's why, again, I feel like we can do all of this. This isn't an either or, quite the contrary. The more that we deploy assets behind mission, I think the more that we will grow that endowment and leave to future generations the ability to drive even more impact.
Great. Actually, I'm going to weave in a question from the audience into this discussion. The question is the board committed to equity-oriented, socially responsible investment with high environment, social, and governance ratings? And is TDF willing to support partners with PRI investments in addition to grants? So John, why don't we first have you talk a little bit about the board's commitment to SRI and living our values through our investments?
Sure. There's no better, we vote with our money, I guess. So the answer to the question is yes. And evidence of that is we've already made a commitment to transfer $40 million from our endowment fund, from the traditional investment pool into our SRI investment pool. And that's just the beginning, a first step of how we plan to look at our investments as part of our, as a component of our mission. We've for a number of years had a very innovative impact investment program that we've been running. We have a commitment that allocates resources, again, some of which come from the Fund for Denver, from our endowment. Impact investment is an alternative form of philanthropy that allows us to essentially loan money or invest in early innovative ideas that advance the mission that we feel is important for the community. I'll give you an example because it was kind of a fun little visit we did with our Impact Investment Committee. We went to Prodigy Coffee. We were the early investor in Prodigy Coffee, which is essentially a small nonprofit business that trains young people who have maybe a not too solid work history in the process of work, pays them to do it. They get training, they get paid, and then they move on and out to other careers. It's a tremendous thing, but it's a loan that was made to Prodigy Coffee. It wasn't just a grant. That money can then be recycled back and loaned out again or invested out again. So it's a lot of you know more about impact investing than I do, but seeing it in action is really impressive, and seeing those kids behind the coffee machines working 8-hour shifts, showing up for work every day, getting training, learning how to work with other people, all those, developing all those job skills. That was the result of an impact investment made into someone who had a great idea to make a change in the community.
Great, thank you, John. We've touched on this a little. Javier, will you talk to us about selecting the new investment firm?
First, the new firm is NEPC, and we do have a webinar set on March 24th that we would invite everyone to participate in, to welcome NEPC and introduce them to our partners. This selection was made after a very thorough and intense process led by Tad Kelly and our investment committee, powered by Dan Lee, our CFO, and the entire finance team. The goals were first to respond to donor demand for more investment options, and also to advance our racial equity goals. And we believe that with the team at NEPC, we're going to be in a position to do that effectively.
Great, thank you, Javier. Let's, we're reaching the end of our panelist time, so we're going to focus one last question and then wrap up on what this looks like on the ground. But first, I'd like to talk about our donor services and asset stewardship. Those are both important parts of the business model. Desa, what changes should donors expect?
Well, one thing I think donors should not expect to change is our commitment and support of donor advised funds. That's a really critical part of both our business model, and we know services that our donors are very eager to continue. But we do anticipate continuing to elevate our customer service for our donor advised fund holders, as well as our fund holders of various types. and continue to provide better stewardship, to share our community expertise when it's appropriate, and to make sure that, that donors are feeling welcomed and embraced by the organization. The second thing that I would say is that we're changing our staffing a little. We have some new staff that, that we've brought on in the last year who are very committed to providing support to your legal and financial advisors so that there's really a full set of resources and opportunities that come as you're thinking about your planning, as well as a new staff member who will be focused on testamentary gifts, which is really exciting, I think, and something that we've heard folks asking for some additional resources around. And then, finally, I would say from a business model perspective and a community perspective, the Denver Foundation's been around for 100 years, which makes it this amazing home for generational generosity. And so, making sure that we're throwing our doors open to everyone and inviting everyone in to be a part of that is a really key part of our business model.
Thank you, Desa. So again, on the ground now, what does this change mean for nonprofits? I'll stick with you, Desa.
Sure. So some things that will look the same for nonprofits and some things that will look a little different. The things that you can continue to count on us for include a continued commitment to racial equity and constituent leadership. So, organizations that are on their own racial equity journey, organizations that are BIPOC led and BIPOC serving, organizations that are reaching deep into community and inviting community voice to inform their services, their work, their policy agenda, all that they do. Those two things will be the formative foundation of what we evaluate when we're looking at grant making. So you can expect that to continue and continue to be elevated. There are some differences in the subject areas that the foundation is going to be funding for nonprofit organizations. It previously focused on education, economic opportunity, and basic human needs, as well as leadership and equity as a theme that flowed across those and had its own portfolio as well. From the deep community listening that we did, we heard some things that were just the same as what we were focused on, as well as some things that were different. One that we heard really strongly and was part of our drive to create our policy and government affairs position was this idea of being part of the civic fabric, being this kind of idea marketplace that Javier was talking about, and really supporting organizations that were doing both grasstops policy work and grassroots community organizing. We also heard that the economic opportunity work that was happening, particularly in workforce and community wealth building, were really important and needed to continue and be amplified as a part of our grant making. In our education area, folks really dug deep into the K-12 reforms that prioritize racial equity that we've been funding for the last many years, and also elevated something that's new to us, which is school funding. So that will be an area that we'll be exploring together with organizations in the community. We brought in a focus on environment and climate, particularly energy efficiency, renewable energy, and air quality. And then from our basic human needs arena, housing really rose to the top. And I would, it's fourth on this list, but it was number one in everybody's mind, which I'm sure surprises no one on this call. But really thinking about affordable housing, particularly for our lowest income residents, as well as a continued focus on people experiencing homelessness. And finally, the addition of transportation, and particularly public transit accessibility and affordability. So using the racial equity and constituent leadership lens, then moving into people focused on these areas of work will inform our community grants program giving. But I would also really highlight for our nonprofit partners that the Denver Foundation is a place of wide generosity and wide giving. that we have many funds focused on many different areas. You know, everything from our field of interest funds to our special project funds like Transforming Safety, focused on criminal justice reform, to our critical needs fund, which is focused very much on basic human needs, things like food security, to our relationship with donors who want to partner with us in giving to organizations, or who have a spirit of generosity and connection to many organizations far beyond the reach of the Denver Foundation's immediate giving. And so organizations should expect all of that to continue, and for us to continue to be on the lookout for areas where we can support where we can support you.
Great. One last question before we go to our Q&A. And let's just talk about more generally, what does this change for the community? Why don't we start with Javier?
Well, I hope that it's what everyone on this call today has heard. It's about leadership, about co-creation, about listening, about learning, about passion, about humility. That's what I hope the community comes to know from the Denver Foundation over the course of this new vision for our work.
Great. John, you want to talk about what this the shift in the Board of Trustees means to the community?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's a shift in the board. It's a continuation. We've had great leadership in the past. Juanita, who's above me on the screen here, has steered us through a very difficult and challenging period. Not as challenging as in the lives of the people who live in the community, but challenging from our perspective. With change is always difficult, and helped us navigate with her wisdom and her calm approach to dealing with crisis. I think you're going to see a very unified board, a very diverse board, a board that's very open to differing points of view, and wants to listen and wants to reflect back to the community what the community's priorities are.
Nita, would you like to weigh in your experience as our past trustee and involved with several boards across the city?
Yeah, I think what the community can look forward to is that they will not be working with an organization that's so systematized that you can't touch it, feel it, and work in it. I think the ideology here that I am hoping that you heard over the past hour is we really are trying to co-create a system that is grounded in racial equity, that delivers what it needs to do to disrupt the inequities that we've got in our communities. And so to have a system that's fluid enough for engagement with community, a natural kind of engagement, is what I think you'll look forward to out of the Denver Foundation.
Javier, anything to wrap up before we go to Q&A?
You know, my sense is that the country is paying attention to what's happening here in Denver. And the country needs Denver to succeed, because the changes that we're experiencing here are being felt or will be felt in communities throughout the country. So the solutions we build here can guide solutions in other communities across America. So together with all of you, with all of our partners, the Denver Foundation wants to be the place where these solutions are built. And I think with this framework, with this vision, we're absolutely positioned to do that.
Great, thank you, Javier.